Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the program. Today we're going to talk about this article titled Crops Were Cultivated in Regions of the Amazon Up to 10,000 Years Ago. Basically, in a nutshell, they're reporting on these forest islands in the northern part of Bolivia, which basically means, they're not actually islands in the sense of like there's water and stuff like that. More so in there are these patches of obvious areas that were obviously home to domesticated roots, crops, and trees. So I thought this is really interesting because it's relevant to what I was talking about on the past couple of weeks in terms of how far back plant domestication and cultivation and agriculture in the Amazon basin, and also it goes hand in hand with the terra preta that I talked about a couple of weeks ago as well. So I want to give you guys some background info first, and this has to do with the tree regime and the selected cultivation of the Amazon basin area, which again you can see on this map. You can see the Amazonas here. This article centers around northern Bolivia, which is where this pinprick is. You can see, and it's a little bit up north. So this is a vast area that we're talking about, and that allegedly was home to this selected cultivation of these crops. So I just want to go over a few points before we actually go through this. So one, there's always been huge hints of intelligent guided project thousands of years ago, right? This guided project being this in a sense gardening and selecting for different useful plants. So it's definitely not a pristine natural environment that just came about haphazardly. It's basically a thousands and thousand year old footprint of again crop cultivation as a result of human creation. That's the first point. Second point is that there are patterns of unexpected dominance and density of a small group of plant species that exists. The Amazon is home to, so for an example, there's about 16,000 wooded tree species in the Amazon. This is an estimate, but this is largely, if you ask most botanists, they'll say that that's roughly the number of the different woody tree species. But only 227 of them are hyperdominant species that dominate all of the forested areas of the Amazon basin. Now there are different variations, and there are different species. There's a variety of plant species in the entire Amazon. Because again, we're talking about a huge land. If you boil it down, there's very few of these quote oligarchs, these tree oligarchs that make up only 1.4% of all the forest species combined in terms of trees, but they cover half of the trees in any given forest. So that suggests that at the very least, most of the surface area is covered by 1.4% of these hyper dominant tree species. So again, when I look at this information anyway, I'm keeping this in mind, and I'm also keeping in mind that okay, if these are the remnants of a society that was selecting what they grew and was cultivating and guiding and essentially creating a huge country-sized greenhouse or farm, essentially, then thousands of years later you would expect this to be the case. So in these clusters of hyperdominance, archaeological sites are found among them. That's really interesting as well. That's a huge point. Whenever they find these clusters, they also find that there were human settlements there as well. So if you're an archaeologist, you would want to investigate these sites that have these hyper-dominant species. That would be a good start. That would be a good lead. If you were a detective, essentially, and you wanted to get to the bottom of this, then that would be your logical step, is to visit these sites. So all of this suggests plant domestication by Amazonian peoples and refutes the idea of Amazon forests that were untouched by man, right? So domestication shaped these forests the way they look now. Past human intervention had a lasting role in domesticated plant distribution. So this is very important to understand. So let's just go through the article, and then I'll give you some of my commentary as we go. So some regions of the Amazon have been profoundly altered by humans dating back 10,000 years. This is a huge statement in terms of the mainstream, because before this date has been passed off, the dates were considerably younger. So about like 1,000, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, those were the dates that were being passed around. But now, in terms of domestication anyway, 10,000 years is a pretty good start. So this article centers around the findings of this international team, that the crops were being cultivated in a remote location, what is now northern Bolivia. And so it would be this area here. Pretty much the Amazon Basin, if you want to look at the topography of the area. So the people that were living here were planting squash, cassava, and maize. And cassava we'll get back to, also known as manioc. We will go through that because that's very interesting. And it has to do with, it's the same concept of ayahuasca in terms of processing it. And I'll get to that in a second. The inhabitants also created thousands of artificial islands in the forest, meaning islands, if you want to, you can call it islands, you can call it whatever, patches of land, but just think about your neighborhood, right? Think about all the different neighborhoods in your town, no matter where you live. If you live in LA or maybe a more sparsely populated area, no doubt wherever you go, it would either look like a grid, which they have found through LiDAR, or it would just be patches, right? So if you're growing stuff, which I guess most people do now still, some people don't, but back then in the ancient world, most people were growing their own stuff, right? I don't think there were markets back then. Well, the markets the way we have them now. So you would expect that there would be these islands, right? These patches of land where there'd be, domesticated plants. So it would look like that. So the inhabitants, okay, according to this article, created thousands of artificial islands in the forest. The early civilizations began to move away from living as hunter-gatherers and started to cultivate crops for food. This is about 10,000 years ago. So by 8,000 BC, in the wake of the Younger Dryas. Researchers have previously unearthed evidence that crops were domesticated at 4 important locations around the world. So this is general knowledge. Generally speaking, most experts believe that in China there was the rise of cultivation of rice. Middle East, it was grains. Central America and Mexico, it was maize, which is corn. Which they're starting to think now that maize was cultivated in South America too, before it made its way to Mexico. And then potatoes and quinoa emerged in the Andes. So now the Llanos de Moxos region, which is southwestern Amazonia, right here, is going to be seen as the 5th key region because of manioc and squash and cassava root and stuff like that. Because the reason why is because this area, which is now savanna, is dotted with raised areas of land now covered in trees. So this is a picture, right? So there's all this savanna, and then you have these blots of just overgrowth, right? Very peculiar, very interesting. And then at all these blots, there's a high likelihood that this, if you were to excavate, there would probably be some sort of archaeological site here, which this article doesn't mention that, but there have been studies that have been put out and observations that, whenever we find domesticated plants, there seems to be people who lived here, remnants of human activity. So go figure, right? These forest islands remained above the waters whenever there are floods that happen throughout the year. Some 4,700 of these small mounds were developed by humans over time in a very mundane way, according to Dr. Umberto Lombardo from the University of Bern, Switzerland. So this is what he says. Of course, rubbish is very rich in nutrients, and as these areas grow, they rise above the sea level, the level of the flood during the rainy season, so they become good places to settle with fertile soil. The fertile soil being a big thing, perhaps terra preta. This article doesn't make much mention of, or any mention at all of terra preta, but it would be interesting to see if they found terra preta at these areas. Right now, he's basically adopting the position that, these are just all trash piles and trash heaps, and they've accumulated so much trash and these midden piles that they've served to provide the nutrients to the soil of these areas for up until the modern day, right? That's what he's saying. The researchers examined some 30 of these islands for evidence of crop planting. They discovered tiny fragments of silica called phytoliths when they started examining these islands. And what these phytoliths are, they're tiny pieces of glass that form inside the cells of plants. So this is a very interesting observation. I don't know if this is terra preta outright, but again, they found some peculiarity of the earth that occupies the surface area of these islands. So here we're getting to part of the article now where they talk about manioc, right? So researchers were able to identify evidence of manioc, which is cassava or yucca, that were grown 10,350 years ago. Squash appears 10,250 years ago, and maize just roughly 7,000 years ago. So let me tell you a little bit about manioc now. So manioc is very interesting because if it's not processed correctly, it's highly toxic to people. So in order to process it, you must first... reading it doesn't seem complicated, but you have to understand how much trial and error must have happened for them to even reach this conclusion if they didn't know about manioc previously. So you have to peel the roots, grate them, strain and press them, and then the resulting mush removes the toxins, which is hydrocyanic acid. So basically a next door neighbor to cyanide. And then toast it to make a yellowish flour. And then once they have the yellowish flour, it's safe to eat. So all this is done to safely consume it now. So when was this first devised? That's the obvious question now. The fact that manioc exists and that was grown 10,350 years ago suggests that someone with an interest in the Amazon already understood the potentials of this plant, followed steps to avoid its dangers, then cultivated it, and then spread that mode of operations, right, that order of operations to everyone else in the population. And they started doing it, and it became part of their culture, and they passed those skills on all the way to the present day. That's very, very thought-provoking and interesting thing to think about when you're reading an article such as this. And then there's another guy. His name is Charles R. Clement of Brazil's National Institute of Amazonian Research. And he describes the Amazon, the entirety of Amazonia, as a major center of crop domestication on a global scale. Okay? So this is one of the few guys, the early guys who went out on a limb and started saying, yeah, they were pretty, in terms of agriculture, they were pretty advanced for their time. He was one of the guys that pointed it out. So this is what he says. At least 83 native species were domesticated to some degree, including manioc, sweet potato, cacao, tobacco, pineapple, and hot peppers, as well as numerous fruit trees and palms, and at least another 55 imported neotropical species were cultivated. So not only were they growing and devising their own ways of processing these crops, they were importing a large number of them as well into South America. So he continues, the widespread distribution of the pineapple in the Americas at the time of the European conquest, the diversity and quality of the cultivars not surpassed after 1 century of modern intensive breeding, the diversity of uses, the economic and cultural importance of the crop, all point to a very ancient domestication. This is Charles Clements from Brazil's National Institute of Amazonian Research. Okay. So out of the 83 crops native to Amazonia and the 55, quote, exotic ones that were imported, a total of 138 crops, okay, those two combined, Clements and his colleagues classify 52 of that 138, including the pineapple, as fully domesticated. Of these 52, 14, or 27% of these fully domesticated plants are fruit or nut trees or woody vines. Among the 41 crops classified as semi-domesticated, 35 of them are fruit or nut trees or woody vines. So basically what that means is the rainforest was coaxed, shaped, and transformed by what can only be described as scientific practices into a vast garden of useful and productive trees. Okay? So that is a hallmark, right? That's pretty much as close of a smoking gun as you can get, besides someone traveling into time from that time period and telling you that they were growing them. You need not look any further than just what exists today, the remaining footprint, the botanical footprint that is being left now, right? So Charles Clements, he says, this is a passage from this article. Overall, 68% of these Amazonian crops are trees or woody perennials. In landscapes largely characterized by forest, a predominance of tree crops is perhaps not surprising. Nonetheless, the most important subsistence crop domesticated in Amazonia is an herbaceous shrub. Manioc and several other domesticates are also root or tuber crops, most of which are adapted to savanna forest transitional ecotones with pronounced dry seasons. Okay, and again, this article centers around savannas dotted with these these crop islands, essentially, these forest islands. Very interesting stuff. And then this ties in with ayahuasca, because again, ayahuasca, you need to go through and figure out how to process it adequately in order to get the desired effect. Well, they were doing this with food as well, right? It's kind of a foregone conclusion. It's kind of illogical once you read all of this evidence that's being presented. So anyway, continuing with the article, this is Amazonia. This is one of these places that a few years ago we thought to be like a virgin forest, an untouched environment. Now we're finding that people were living there 10,500 years ago. And they say they started practicing cultivation, but I don't know. I just think they happened to be practicing cultivation. Who knows when they started it, right? They also survived on sweet potato and peanuts, as well as fish and large herbivores. Researchers say it's likely that humans who lived here may have brought their plants with them. Again, that goes back to the 53 imported crops. So it's interesting in that it confirms again that domestication begins at the start of the Holocene period, when we have this climate change that we see as we exit from the Ice Age. So again, this is basically what the argument boils down to now. Did domestication start at the Holocene period? What about the domestication of dogs? They say dogs were domesticated 15,000 years ago, right? So this idea of direct human manipulation of the environment to shape how the organism, whatever biological organism is being domesticated, into almost a tool that humans can use to benefit their own life. Again, it seems like this argument, did it happen right at the start of the Holocene? Is that when it directly started, or does it go further back? Because manioc, how do they figure out manioc? How do they figure out that? I mean, it's pretty easy to figure out if something's toxic, right? Imagine that you're a tribesman, right? And you come across manioc fresh out of the Ice Age. You eat, one of your tribesmen eats it. They keel over and die. I feel like my natural inclination is to not eat, to stay away from manioc, right? What's the point in fucking with it when it just kills people, right? It has cyanide in it, essentially. But they decided to go through a trial and error process to figure out how to cleanse it and turn it into this flour that's safe to eat. I feel like it just is just me. Now, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Is that possible? I mean, I guess it is possible, but how long does that take before everyone's, like, what happens first? They figure out the manioc process, or everybody in the tribe dies through trial and error? Or does it make more sense that someone coming out of the Pleistocene, out of the Ice Age, already had these skills equipped, and then they taught it to the people? And then and this is all not to mention like the Quetzalcoatl and like all of these colonizing figures outright teaching the indigenous people, the people without these skills, I guess hunter-gatherers and whoever these quote primitive people were. And they came and taught these skills, and then they were heralded as gods, right? These people with beards, and that's all. In light of all of that, doesn't it seem to even just merit more investigation instead of just shouting down the evidence? Because I mean, what's your interpretation, guys? What do you guys think? Because I feel like there's a lot here, especially the fact that there's a direct correlation between these clusters of domesticated plants and archaeological sites. That combined with their religion and their known culture, their known beliefs, and the remnants like the Yanomami tribe and all these remaining tribes there, and all their oral traditions say that the shamans this was taught to them, right? When you talk about ayahuasca, the shamans say that this was passed down, right? From the gods or whoever it was, the spirits taught them. It wasn't something that they figured out, because I feel like if they figured it out, then that would be apparent in their lore, in their culture, in their oral tradition, right? Anyway, let me know what you guys think about this. I thought it was a pretty thought-provoking video. I'll just see you guys on Friday.